The iPhone is not just the best-selling gadget ever created, it's probably the most influential one too. Since Steve Jobs announced the iPhone in 2007, Apple has sold over 2.2 billion of them, creating giant businesses for app developers and accessory makers. In this video, we will go through how they came up with the idea for the iPhone, and how they took that idea and created a product that revolutionized an entire market and our lives. In 2004, 50% of Apple's revenue came from the iPod. From its first release in October of 2001 to implementing iTunes for Windows and it being a hit in 2003, it was already deemed vulnerable in 2004. The growing popularity of MP3 players in phones made Apple worried. Tony Fadell, Apple's head of iPod, said, "If you could only carry one device, which one would you choose?" At this time, one of the most popular phones on the market was Motorola's Razr flip phone. Motorola's new CEO, Ed Sander, and Jobs were friends, and together they started looking at ways to collaborate. And in the summer of 2004, the iTunes phone was born. For Apple, partnering with Motorola was an easy way to try to neutralize a threat to the iPod. Motorola would make the handset and Apple would make the iTunes software. It was in a sense a way to give the people a taste of iTunes that would turn them to buy the iPod. But inside Apple, there was a lot of question marks. The rocker phone, that it was going to be called, was terrible. Fadell says, "We all knew how bad it was. They are slow, they can't get things to change, they are going to limit the songs." All of these things were coming together to make sure it was a really shitty experience. Before the iPhone, everyone at Apple thought that cell phones sucked. They were terrible, just pieces of junk. But Apple is best when fixing things that people hate. And for at least a year before the launch of the iPhone project, there was a growing sense at Apple that maybe we need to go in and clean up this market too. Jobs, however, was reluctant to making a phone. He said in an interview in 2005, "The problem with the phone is that we're not very good going through carriers to get to the end users. Carriers have now gained the upper hand in the terms of the power of the relationship with the handset manufacturers. So the handset manufacturers are really getting these thick books from the carriers telling them what your phone's going to be, and we're not good with that." But a lot of executives tried to convince Jobs, and one of them was Mike Bell. He was convinced that the phones were heading into a new era and that they would be the next big thing. He said, "We were spending all this time putting iPod features in Motorola's phones. That just seemed ass backwards to me. If we just took the iPod user experience and some of the other stuff we were working on, we could own the market." It was getting harder to argue with that logic, and on November the 7th of 2004, Bell sent a late-night email. "Steve, I know you don't want to do the phone, but here's why we should do it. Johnny Ive has some really cool designs for future iPods that no one has seen. We ought to take one of those, put some Apple software around it, and make a phone out of it ourselves, instead of putting our stuff on other people's phones." Jobs would call him right away. They argued for hours, pushing back and forth, but eventually Steve came around. "Okay, I think we should do it." So Steve, Bell, and Johnny had lunch a couple of days later and launched the iPhone project. A couple of months earlier, Jobs had closed down a project for a tablet similar to the iPad that used a new technique that Apple had designed for a touchpad because of its lack of use case and for it being too expensive. The project was called Q79 Tablet Project. One of the head of the project was Bas Ording. A couple of days after the iPhone project launched, he got a call from Jobs. "We're gonna do a phone. It's gonna have a small screen, it's gonna be just touchscreen. There's not gonna be any buttons, and everything has to work on that." Steve told Ording that he wanted a demo of scrolling through a virtual address book with multi-touch. This was exciting news for the Q79 tablet project, since they finally might have found a use case for their invention. Development had continued on the Roker throughout 2005, but the phone was still terrible. Steve Jobs didn't see the finished project until right before he was supposed to unveil it to the world in September of 2005. He was like, what else can we do and how can we fix it? He knew it was subpar, but he didn't know how bad it was going to be. When it finally got there, he didn't even want to show it on stage because he was so embarrassed by it, Fadell says. When Jobs got off stage, he was upset and angry. This is not gonna fly. I'm sick and tired of dealing with Bosu handset guys, Jobs told Fadell after the demo. That was the ultimate thing, Fadell says. It was, this, we're going to make our own phone. Steve called a big meeting in the boardroom. He decided to put two teams together to compete on making the best iPhone. P1 was a project headed by Tony Fadell that would make an iPod-based phone. This was the more doable project and more predictable. Then there was P2, which was headed by Scott Forstall and the Mac OS team. Steve liked the idea of making a phone-based Mac OS, but he didn't think it was realistic. Steve Forstall had raised the rank in Apple fast. He came with the next acquisition that would bring Jobs back to Apple. Forstall was a big fan of Jobs and would mimic his leadership and held a strong grip on his employees, forcing them to work long hours and at tight deadlines. Fadell and Forstall became arch enemies and big competitors. Both of them wanted to head the project. Fadell and his team had Jobs support at the beginning, but their phone wasn't as easy to use as Forstall's team. Fadell built a phone that looked like an iPod with a phone in it. You would use the wheel to turn to get letters or numbers, but it wasn't user-friendly. In the meantime, the Mac OS team built a phone with touchscreen that worked and looked amazing. When you touched the screen, it would track your finger perfectly. When you pull down, it will pull down. The P1 team saw the phone as an extension of the iPod, while the P2 team didn't see them as a chance to build a phone. They saw it as an opportunity to use a phone-shaped device as a Trojan horse for a much more complex kind of mobile computer. In the end, P2 OS X team won. The software for the iPhone would be built by Scott Forstall's Next Mafia, and the hardware would go to Fadell's group. By 2006, the basic contours of iPhone project had been defined. The home screen and how the apps would look was pretty much done. The project had all of the best engineers and designers at Apple in one room creating something that has never been done before. It was Apple's version of the Fight Club. They were isolated from everyone else in the company. It was their own tight group building something they couldn't talk about. They worked hard. They spent days and nights trying out new features and building new applications. Scott Forstall would rent out hotels next to the office so people working on the project didn't have to go home. Marriages would end, and socializing outside of work became non-existent for the workers. None of us had built a phone before. We were figuring it out as we went along. It was the one time it felt like design and engineering were working together to solve these problems. We'd sit together and figure it out. It's the most influence over a project I've ever had or ever will have, John Wright, an OS engineer, said. There was a couple of things that were mandatory. As much freedom as the carrier was willing to give Apple, the iPhone would have to abide by certain requirements. One of those features was voicemail, but they didn't just want to have regular voicemail. So how can we make it better? Well, what if voicemail was like email? Ideas like this bled through the group, and the members seized on them, implemented them, tested them, discarded them, or embraced them. They emerged in brainstorming session or in late-night coding sprees. Whatever idea that they made had to follow 3 rules. Home button, always take you back home. Everything has to respond instantly to a user's touch. Every app has to run at least 60 frames per second. All operations. One of the hardest parts about the iPhone was its processors. They turned to Samsung, who had created the ARM processor for the iPod, making them believe they were creating a new iPod. They would show Samsung exactly what was needed, and they delivered. With the help of Samsung's tireless chip team, the custom arm was finished and slotted in within 6 months. The phone was slowly getting there, but they still had issues. Postponing the launch was not an option. There was too little else to fall back on, and Macworld's events were legendary for new product debuts, and if Apple didn't have anything substantial to show off, the company's stock could suffer. The solution was a golden path, a sequence of actions to make it appear for the crowd of tech journalists that the iPhone worked seamlessly. Multiple phones would be used, and Jobs had to use sleight of hands to switch between phones when showing off new features. On the 9th of January 2007, the Moscone Center was packed with exciting journalists. They had heard rumors about a new phone, but there was no images or information leaked on how it would look like or work. Steve Jobs took the stage, and about 20 minutes in, it was time.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. Well, today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. So, 3 things: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
The iPhone was a smashing success, and it started shipping in June of 2007. The 6 months that had passed from the presentation had been filled with a lot of work fixing bugs and implementing new features, such as YouTube and Google Maps. In its first 36 hours, Apple moved over 270,000 units. But the first iPhone was very locked down. There was no App Store, the phone ran on a 2G network, and nothing was customizable. Not even the wallpaper could be changed. And it was, according to most newspapers, too expensive. Microsoft's Steve Ballmer famously denounced the phone.
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
The hit feature was Safari and Google Maps, which showcased the possibilities of what the iPhone could do. That and the touchscreen itself, which was very easy to use. The next year, Apple would release the iPhone 3G with a lowered price and the added App Store, which turned the iPhone into a global powerhouse. It would take years for any competition to come close to iPhone's success. And the phone changed the phone market forever and how we go with our everyday lives. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like button. If you want to see more of the same content, hit that subscribe button. I will have more videos like this coming out next week.